Well, what do you like to do for Christmas, and what does Christmas mean to you? These are such interesting questions, I think, because everybody this time of the year is thinking about what are they going to do for Christmas. And we are also asking ourselves a question about what is Christmas really, about to us, and what is the real meaning behind what Christmas is supposed to be. As a church over the last few weeks, we've been kind of exploring looking at kind of the story of Christmas that that everybody's familiar with, right? The cultural kind of Christmas, the Christmas that is the songs and the music and the celebration and the food and all family and being together. But then also kind of saying, okay, well, there's some deeper levels to what we think about in terms of Christmas. And for a lot of people, that deeper level is just kind of a religious kind of level. I go to church, I go to church on Easter, I go to church on Christmas, or I do these religious things during this season of Christmas. But actually, neither one of those is the real story behind the story. The story behind the story of Christmas is what we're talking about in this series. And we started with what is Christmas? And then last time we talked about when is Christmas? And today, our title is called, well, why Christmas? You can't really say why is Christmas. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But why Christmas? It's an interesting thing to try to just think about, and we could explore this question in history, right? We could talk about how Christmas became what it is today in our culture through various pieces of historical event. But if we really wanted to get at the story behind the story, we'd have to go behind that. This is more than just the History Channel version of the origins of Christmas. We would have to explore the real heart and meaning of it. Now, for a lot of people, the answer to the story of Christmas is found in Matthew, in Luke, and especially Luke's gospel, because you get the Christmas story. But today, what I want us to do is to look at something that another author in the New Testament wrote about. This person never tells us much at all about what he knows about the birth of Jesus, but he does tell us about the why of the birth of Jesus. And it's in a very strange and kind of obscure place in the New Testament. It's in the middle of a letter that he wrote to Christians in a community called Galatia. And so the letter is called the Galatians. And in the 4th chapter, in just 2 verses, chapter 4, verse 4 and 4, verse 5, he gives to us an answer to this question about the why of Christmas. In Galatians 4:4, it says, "But when the set time had fully come." Now stop there for a second and say, your translation, if you're using a different translation than NIV, maybe you're using ESV or King James or something like that. The different translations translate these words differently. When the time had fully come, the original word here, time, is 2 words, really well-known words in the original language of Greek. One is chronos, the other is kairos. Kairos is like seasonal time, like fall, winter, spring. But chronos is chronological time, and that's the word that's used here. When the chronological time, like when the on the calendar date moment happened. But the way it's translated here is it says when it had fully come. In the original language, pleroma means the fullness of something. It's like you got out a cup and you began to fill it until it get all the way to the top, and then it started to bubble over, or it started to flow over, spill over. The idea is that when it was full, when time reached the perfect moment, another way to translate this is at the perfect time, or as the NIV translates it here, when the set time had fully come. This is what God did. He sent his son. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not, but God could have done a lot of things. And in fact, if you read the story behind the story, which is the Old Testament, there are 39 chapters in our Old Testament. They tell stories of God doing a lot of great things and sending a lot of great people. He sent Abraham, and he sent this guy named Moses, and he sends this great king named David. But all through the Bible, God sends great prophets and great leaders and great men and women of faith. But now, in this moment, it says that God's sending something even bigger than that. God sent his son, born of a woman. Now, this is interesting. We know this so well, we don't even really think about it, but God did not have to do it this way. God did not have to send his son to be born in a manger or to be born through a person. God could have done it any way he wanted to. God could have just said, like, maybe if we were God, we would have been like, you know what? I think I'm just going to have him, I'm going to send Jesus down there, and he's just going to say, hey, everybody, in all of his power and all of his glory, y'all need to get your lives straightened out and start following me, right? That could have been what he did. In fact, it's kind of the way we sometimes imagine the best way he could have done it. But what it says here is that when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Now, that doesn't mean that he was born in a country that had laws. It means specifically the law of Israel, the covenant relationship that God had made with his people. The descendants of Abraham, there on Mount Sinai with Moses, entered into a covenant with God. And that covenant law meant that if they did what he said, he would bless them, and if not, he would curse them. They were born under that covenant. They were bound by that covenant. They were obligated to live out the requirements of that covenant, but all history tells us that they failed. And the biblical word for failing to live up to the law is called trespass, or it's the English word sin. They sinned. They were born under this law that they couldn't actually live out. And so it says in verse 5 that God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem. Now, we use the word redeem all the time for different things. The word redeem in English is really close to the original word. It's this idea of redemption, of making a payment to release something. The redemption, though, in this setting was specifically about the ancient Roman slave system. When someone was bought or when someone was set free, manumission. You could be set free through payment, and that payment was called redemption. God sent his son to be the payment of redemption, to set free, to liberate, to take away the bondage, the slavery, it says. To redeem those under the law. Everybody who's under this curse because they didn't live out the righteousness of God and they had failed to live up to the covenants of God. They were all living under the verdict of their own inability to do it. And so God sent his son. Why? It says so that we might receive adoption to sonship. This is such an interesting thing. Like, we have adoption in our culture, and it's an amazing thing. I always think about it in our own family. My grandmother was adopted, and if it wasn't for adoption, I wouldn't be here, right? We think about that in our lives. In Roman culture, though, adoption works differently than in our culture. In our culture, when you adopt someone, you can adopt them, and then you can do whatever you want after that. In Roman law, though, once you adopted someone, you could not unadopt them. They were forever a permanent rightful heir of the inheritance of the family. And so it's incredible what it says here in this passage is that God sent his son to set all these people who couldn't live up to what they were supposed to set them free. And not only set them free, but then place them in a forever family that they could never be removed from ever again. That there was nothing that they could do to be removed from that forever family. And so when we start talking about the why of Christmas, it is at such a deeper level than the cultural understanding of what this is all about. But if we could dial it all the way back to the first verses of this, or the first words of this verse, but when the time fully came, I like for us to camp out on that for just a moment. Let's pretend that you and I decided we were going to study the history of the world. Maybe say this, just the story of Western civilization. And we were to say, all right, what we want to do is we want to figure out what would be the best time for this to happen. What would be the best time for God to do this thing? Why not yesterday or tomorrow? Or why 2,000 years ago and not 4,000 years ago? What made it so right that 2,000 years ago was the perfect time for all of this to take place? The why of Christmas. What is the story behind the story, and why did it need to happen at this moment? If you and I were a historian trying to study this, and historians have, you would come away with some amazing observations about why this was the only time in history when this could have happened in the way that it would happen. The first thing you'd have to realize is that Jesus was born at a time when the Romans were in power and under the Roman rule of the world, and they ran all of the western part of the world. Everywhere within their power, there existed an absence of conflict. Now, we call an absence of conflict in English today, we call that peace. And the Romans did too. They called it Pax Romana, or Roman peace. Historians who've studied the why of this time in history have come away with an incredible observation that because the entire world was in a place of peacefulness, this was a time when this message could have more easily gotten out all over the place. And in fact, when we read the story, we call it the Christmas story in Luke's gospel, it starts by telling us this, if we pay attention. Listen to the words of Luke chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. When you read that, you just kind of skip on and you're kind of getting to the Christmas story. Caesar Augustus was the Roman emperor. He was the first Roman emperor. He was the one that brought Pax Romana. He was the one who had instituted, by the force of military might, by the end of a Roman sword, who said, all right, you guys aren't going to fight against each other, or you're going to fight with us. And everywhere there was Roman peace. But Roman peace was always a form of peace that had a sense of brutality. And still, even today, when people think about peace, more often than not, they think of the absence of conflict. When I turn on the news or flip through my phone and see on Google News all of the wars that are going on, and see what's happening in Israel, the Ukraine, I think to myself, God, I just wish so much there could be peace. When I do that, I am communicating a common understanding of peace. But what if there was a different understanding of peace? What if the way people thought about peace was actually not what peace really is? In other words, I wonder if this story of Christmas really says something even deeper about peace. Well, actually it does. Because when the story starts in Luke chapter 2 and it says, all right, there was this decree issued, a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. It was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. Christmas story starts. Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem, but outside of Bethlehem, shepherds are in a field. An angel says to them that Messiah has been born. And then a whole bunch of angels show up. And look what they say in Luke chapter 2, verse 13. Suddenly a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth, what's the word? It's peace. And on earth, peace on those whom his favor rests. The announcement of the birth of Jesus was the announcement of peace, but you know what? The world still got war in it, doesn't it? So what is meant by that? Well, we have our culture's understanding of peace. Rome had their understanding of peace, but the Bible has another understanding of peace. The common expression when you meet another person in the Jewish culture today or in the ancient Hebrew language culture of the ancient world, the common way you greet each other is you would say in Hebrew, shalom. Shalom is a word that means, in English, peace, but it doesn't mean the same thing as the English word peace. So when the Bible uses the word peace, it's not talking about the absence of conflict. Shalom means to live in wholeness of relationship with God and to live in that same way with other people. To live in right relationship with God and each other. It is imagining what life was like in the Garden of Eden. It is imagining what life is like in the kingdom of God. It's imagining the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's imagining what heaven is like, where everything is the way that it's supposed to be. And the announcement of Jesus, the announcement of Christ of Christmas, is the announcement that God is finally going to bring into the world real, lasting, permanent peace between him and between each other. This is the idea of peace. So when we start to explore the question of why Christmas, we start to get the answer that, well, in those days, there was this great empire that made it where it was possible to share the message. But there's something else, and you may have studied this or have heard this before. That one of the reasons why this was the perfect time in history is because everyone spoke the same language. There was a common language in those days spoken across the empire, and we simply call this language Greek, or technically Koine Greek. Koine means that it's the language that was commonly spoken. We have the word koine in English. The word koinonia is a very famous word. Koine just means common, the common Greek. It's the street language. It's the same as the Latin word vulgar or vulgate, the language of the street, just the everyday language. Did you know that the entire New Testament, 27 books, are written in one language, Koine Greek? Did you know that when they quote the Old Testament, they quote it in Greek? Did you know that Paul, in all of his ministry and missionary work, primarily spoke in the language of Greek? And it's because it's an estimated 93% of the Roman Empire spoke one language. They all could speak Greek. And this created an incredible opportunity for the gospel, this message, to be communicated. Never before in history was there a moment like that, where everyone's speaking the same language. And if you want to go back and read your history books, you can go and see that that is because of this guy named Alexander the Great, who conquered the world and made everybody learn the Greek language. Now, what's interesting in the Bible is to look at this story in reverse, because there's an example in the Old Testament of this happening in the opposite way. In Genesis 11, it says, "But the Lord came down to the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." Man, if you can get everybody talking the same language, if you can get everybody on the same page, moving in the same direction, you're unstoppable. Such a great principle, isn't it? "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they'll not understand each other." And so the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth. And they stopped building the city, and this is why it's called Babel. The word Babel is such an interesting word. In English, Babel is the same sound a baby makes. Babel, babel, babel. It's literally an onomatopoeia. It's just the sound of someone who doesn't know how to speak. And so to each one's ears, it sounded like Babel. Gave rise to this place called Babylon. But in Hebrew, Babel means gate of God. What they were doing is they were building, you can still see them today in that part of the world, these ziggurats, these huge towers, the shape of pyramids, but with like steps going up to the top. And they'd build them because they believed that they, through their great and human ingenuity, they could make their way up to heaven. Babel in Hebrew means gate of God. That they, through their power, that they could reach the heavens. They could become as though they were God. And God said, no, I am going to stop this project, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to confuse their language. And so they couldn't speak. And so it's incredible because the Lord confused their language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the whole face of the earth. Now, that's Genesis 11. After the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus, there's this moment in Acts chapter 2 where the Spirit of God is poured out on the disciples, the followers of Jesus, the apostles, and then they do something incredible. And it's another moment. It's a moment where in Genesis 11, their language was confused, but in Acts chapter 2, on this day called Pentecost, everyone would hear in their own language the message about Jesus. In Acts chapter 2, it says in verse 5, "From there there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard this sound, the sound of the Spirit and the presence of God coming down on them, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken." Now that's amazing, right? Like, it's not just one language. Everyone's hearing their own language. And, it's just an absolutely incredible moment. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans?" Now, the reason they say that is because the Galileans had an accent. They did. They had an accent. Now, some of you say, I know people have an accent, like the preacher, right? He's got an accent, right? And in other words, if you heard somebody with an accent, you'd pick up on it. And the Galileans had an accent, y'all. They just did. you could tell that they ain't like everybody else, so to speak, right? They're just not. And what was incredible is that these Galileans, these fishermen like Peter, could communicate in a way that everyone could hear. Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? They could speak multiple languages. Everybody could speak Greek, but they could also speak their own native language. You know, they say if you know 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you know 2 languages, you're bilingual. If you know 1 language, you're an American. Most cultures in the world are multilingual, aren't they? And look who were there. I mean, some of these places that are named, you've never even heard of them, but they spoke the language of the place. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, that's Babylon or modern-day Iraq. Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt. Other parts of Libya near Cyrene, that's Africa. Visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans, Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked each other, what does it mean? That's what we need to be asking ourselves this morning. What does this mean? What God was doing is He was making it abundantly clear that in one common language, everyone could hear the good news. The book of Acts starts like that, but it doesn't stop like that. It continues. Most of the book of Acts is a story about this guy named Paul going to all different corners of the empire, the Roman Empire, bringing the gospel. And you know what? Everywhere he went, he could speak in one language. This is an image map of the missionary journeys of Paul. He goes on, here he is over here in Israel. It says Syria. He travels across the whole Mediterranean world all the way to Rome. Travels in all these different cities and all these different places. And as he travels, he can speak, and everyone, everywhere can hear him, and they can understand because there is one common language. It says in Acts 14:1, at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into a Jewish synagogue. And they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed because they all spoke the same language. That's why. So if we were historians, we would say, you know what? This was a great moment because of Roman peace, because of a common language. But you probably already have guessed that there's another reason. Romans were famous for one thing in particular, right? The Roman roads. All roads lead to Rome, somebody said. But do you know that the Roman road system wasn't built so that you could drive your chariot on it? They weren't built so your Amazon package would arrive before Christmas or whatever. The Roman road system wasn't built like a modern-day road system or interstate highway system. It was built for one reason alone. It was built for the Roman military, and it was built by the Roman military, and it was maintained by the Roman military. And the purpose of the Roman roads that traveled all over the map was to create a way for the military to move quickly to various parts of the empire to maintain Roman peace. Listen to what it says in Acts 19:1. While Apollos was at Corinth, Paul took the road through the interior. And he arrived at Ephesus, where he found some disciples. Paul took the Roman road. Let's show some pictures of some of this. First of all, we have this map of the Via Ignatia. You can see that this is over here is the boot. That's Italy. That's Greece in the middle. And over on the on the right side is Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There's a road running across the whole thing. So you got your Roman army. You can run them all the way across the whole empire on these roads. And you can see the different names of the roads. Via Ignatia, Via Appia, the Appian Way, and so on. These are just roads that meant this road, that road. These roads are still around. We can show you a picture here of this Roman road that's still intact, that was built by, we have an image of it. This is still used today after 2,000 years. And then you can see next a Roman mile marker. They would place mile markers so you'd know how far you were to the next city, how far you had gone. You could keep track as you traveled along. This road marker right there says, can we go back to that one? Is that possible? No, to there it is, the mile marker. In original Greek and Latin, this actually says 40 more miles to Buc-ee's. So it's the original Buc-ee's sign. I just made that up. So that is not true, okay? And then the next one is a bridge. And you say, why would you show a bridge? Why does that matter? Well, this is a Roman bridge on the Via Sebaste. And it's interesting, it's because Paul walked on that bridge. I just read to you that passage where he took the interior road, and when he did, he walked across this bridge. 2,000 years later, this bridge is still intact. I say that as I always do in these sermons when I point back to history. This stuff wasn't made up. This really happened. This is real. This is a real story. And as we learn the story behind the story, we begin to understand what all of this is really supposed to be about. Why Christmas? Why this point? Why is this the time fully come? Because this was a time of Roman peace, because this was a time of a common language. This was a time when they could travel the roads and they could go everywhere and they could share the gospel. In just a few short years, everyone in the Roman Empire would hear the good news about Jesus. But there's another reason, and you may be less familiar with this one. The Romans did something else that was pretty amazing. Unlike other nations that conquered other nations, like the Babylonians, for example, they didn't force people to convert to their religion. They actually allowed people to practice their religions, almost always. And they allowed, for example, the Jewish people to continue to celebrate their religion. There was what we would today call religious freedom. And the Romans were sort of innovators in this idea. But what it meant that when Paul or other missionaries traveled down Roman roads in the midst of Pax Romana, Roman peace, they could speak one common language and they could share the message about Jesus because their religion was protected. You cannot do that today in our world. You cannot travel in these same places we saw on this map with the kind of religious freedom that they had in those days. There are places in this world where you walk down roads and share the gospel of Jesus, you will find yourself behind bars or worse. The religious freedom that was allowed during the Roman Empire meant it was the perfect time in history for the gospel to come, for Jesus to come, for God to send his Son. Listen to what it says in Acts 15, verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." You can only do that because there was freedom for them to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't ever face any hardships or didn't find themselves in jail. Paul often did, but not for the reasons that everybody always assumes. They weren't persecuting him because of his religious faith, except for one group, and it wasn't the Romans. It was actually his own people, the Jewish nation. When Paul came to Jerusalem and he shared the gospel in Jerusalem, he found himself imprisoned. In Caesarea Maritima, where he spent a considerable amount of time, he gave his testimony before a variety of Herods, until finally he made his appeal to Rome. And on ships traveling across the Mediterranean, shipwrecked and everything else, Paul finally found himself in this painting, in this Rembrandt. He found himself sitting in a Roman prison. Now, this isn't the picture of the Roman prison today. The Roman prison you go to in today, if you were to go to visit the city of Italy, or visit the city of Rome in Italy, they'll take you down into the Mamertine prison. I was there a year ago or so. I mentioned it in the first service, and people who went with me were sending me pictures between the services saying, "Hey, remember when we were there?" It's a cold place. It's a dark place. And we know that the apostle made his appeal to Rome, and he was imprisoned in Rome. And at the end of the book of Acts, he's just literally in chains. But one of the crazy things about Paul is that when Paul was chained up to people, they were also chained to them, and he got to share with them the good news. It's an incredible event that happens at the end of the book. But I just imagine today if we were to pull Paul out of this Rembrandt and let him stand here and talk to us and say, "Paul, why were you willing to do all of that? Why were you willing to go everywhere and share the gospel?" He would say, "Because when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born under the law, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption to sonship. We could be a part of God's forever family." And so I was willing to do that. You know, I've often wondered, especially when I was in college and then later in seminary, and I started thinking about being in ministry and trying to think about serving in ministry, I would often ask myself the question, why isn't our country as spiritually open to the gospel as the Roman world was? Because it's amazing. You read Acts, and everywhere they went, people were like, yeah, give me Jesus. I need Jesus. I want this message of hope. And one of the things that I've come to learn is that part of the reason that this message was so powerful was because this was the perfect time. In those days, people had a lot of religion, but they didn't have any truth. And therefore, there was a spiritual hunger that existed across the Roman Empire. If you walked into any city in Rome, any major city, the center of the city was a thing that Greeks called the agora, the marketplace, and it's surrounded by temples. Man, you had so many gods and so many religions. They had the religions of the Egyptians in the Greek cities and the Roman cities, like Isis. It's the name of the Egyptian god. When Paul comes to this place, this is Athens. He goes through that market and finds himself taken before the leaders of the city of Athens, up on the hill of Ares. The Romans called him Mars, the god of war. And standing on Mars Hill and the Areopagus, he gives an answer to the question that I was asking you. I wonder what he was asking at the end, before the leaders of the city. Something's interesting in this story. It says in Acts chapter 17, verse 19, and they took him and they brought him into a meeting of the Areopagus. This is Paul on trial in Athens before the great minds of the ancient world, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting. You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we just like to know what they mean. That's such a great question, isn't it? But I love how the Bible puts this in parentheses and says this. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. It's like they had their phone out and they were just going through the ideas. Oh, here's an idea. Here's an idea. It paints a picture of spiritual hunger, a longing for something that's true. They're surrounded by thought and information. They're surrounded by culture. They got everything they need, but there's something still missing. There's an emptiness they feel inside and a longing to fill it. And to them, Paul will say, it's like you guys are groping around in the dark. And you're walking through the house and you're kind of trying to, where's the wall and where's the light? And don't hit my knee on the side of the bed. But what you're looking for is not just something just ordinary and simple. You are looking for truth. You're looking for God. And he says, let me just tell you about the God you don't know. If you will seek him, you will find him. If you seek for him with all of your heart. I just want to share that with you today as we continue this series on the story behind Christmas. Maybe you are one of those people who feel the emptiness of life and the longing to fill it with what is true. I want you to know that the answer to the question of why Christmas is that while we were in this bondage and in this slavery to sin, while we were in the dark, God sent his son. And he sent him to set you free. And he sent him to make you a son and a daughter of God, to be a part of his forever family. And if you have never invited him into your life, I cannot think of anything better that you could get for Christmas than to receive him into your heart. Would you pray with me? Father, for the folks in our room, the people that are watching today, perhaps this message has just struck a chord. Perhaps there's somebody here today, maybe many, who would say that there is this emptiness inside of their life and this longing to fill their life with what is true. God, for someone here today who feels the weight of the shackles that hold them down, that bind them in life, that they long to be set free from it, and to know in this season that you sent your Son to set them free, to redeem them. And so, God, I pray in this moment for maybe somebody here today who needs to do that or who's watching to simply admit that they have that need to be set free because of the sin that is holding them down. And to believe that Jesus really is the one who can set them free by being their Savior, serving Him as their Lord, by confessing with their heart and their mouth that Jesus is their Lord and wanting to live their life for Him, knowing that in this moment, making that decision of faith can alter the course of their whole life and bring them into a forever family. I pray, God, for somebody here today who needs to do that, maybe right now, God, that this would be that moment where they would do that very thing. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Would you stand with me? We're going to continue to worship, and as we sing and as we continue to worship, I'm going to be here at the front, but maybe God's speaking to your heart today saying, I need to do that. Or maybe right now you are doing that and have done that and said, I'm making that decision and I need to share that with somebody else. It's a great time at the end of this time of our kind of just sermon to just say, this is when I need to make it known that I'm a follower of Jesus. One of the things you do when you do that is you get to follow Him in what we call baptism, and it's a decision of letting people know that you're a follower of Jesus and becoming a part of the church. Or maybe you've done that and you'd like to be part of this family, this church. Today you'd like to just step forward and say, I want to join this family. And as always, I say this at every service, you can walk right out of these doors and you can walk up to me in the hallway and say, I want to make that same decision. However God's leading you right now as we continue to worship, I want to encourage you to come forward. Our prayer team will be here. If you need someone to pray with you during the service, after the service, they'll be here to pray with you, to pray for you. You come as the Lord leads you.